It's on go, it's on go, it's on go, yeah, yeah. It's on go, it's on go, yeah, yeah, yeah.
Good morning, and welcome to the 2022 American Society of Clinical Oncology Annual Meeting. I'm Dr. Julie Graylow. I'm ASCO's Chief Medical Officer and Executive Vice President, and we thank you for joining us here in Chicago, as well as those of you who are online. This year's meeting is expected to bring together more than 40,000 attendees from around the world, both in person and online. We'll hear official attendance numbers during Dr. Everett Vogt's presidential address tomorrow in the opening session, but I can tell you that about 75% of our registrants plan to attend in person, with the remaining online. As the largest clinical cancer research meeting, every year ASCO features important practice-changing research. Research presented at the 2022 ASCO annual meeting demonstrates the progress we're making against cancer. Over the next several days, you'll hear how ASCO is working towards the meeting's theme this year of advancing equitable cancer care through innovation. More than 2,800 abstracts will be presented during the meeting, and an additional 2,400 will be published online. In addition to today's press briefing, there will be 3 more briefings here on site in this room, one each on Saturday, Sunday, and Monday, and they'll all start at 8 a.m. For today's briefing, we've highlighted 2 abstracts providing important new insights into the treatment of mantle cell lymphoma and KRAS wild-type locally advanced or metastatic pancreatic cancer. Unfortunately, one of our presenters, Dr. Chin, has become unavailable at the very last minute, so we will not have a presentation from him at this press briefing. His prepared slides for this briefing, however, will be available to you to download as part of the press packets, and you will be able to see his full presentation, which he has recorded for his session. As I believe you're all aware, the embargo on these 2 abstracts lifted this morning at 7 a.m. Central Time. I'd now like to introduce Dr. Michael Wong from the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center, who will present the findings from an analysis of ibrutinib in combination with bendamustine and rituximab, and along with rituximab maintenance as first-line treatment for older patients with mantle cell lymphoma. Dr. Wong?
Thank you, Dr. Grillo, for that kind introduction. Thank you for coming. So, ladies and gentlemen, I just keep on advancing, right? So, at this ASCO, I'm very, very excited to present our phase 3 clinical trial. So, this clinical trial, we're presenting at this meeting the primary results of the double-blind, placebo-controlled phase 3 in mantle cell lymphoma. So here are my disclosures. So mantle cell lymphoma is a type of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, accounting about 6% of the whole NHL. So older patients diagnosed with newly diagnosed mantle cell lymphoma are usually treated with chemoimmunotherapies such as R-CHOP therapy, bendamustine rituximab, or VRCAP therapy. And bendamustine rituximab, or BR, has become the most commonly used first-line therapy in this elderly population. Why? Because it has significantly improved the progression-free survival as compared with the R-CHOP therapy, and also with a better safety profile. So rituximab maintenance, or R maintenance, is also a very good addition after BR. With the BR, it has shown to prolong the progression-free survival in 2 independent real-world studies. And BTK inhibitor, ibrutinib, is a first-in-class oral BTK inhibitor that has transformed the care of relapsed mantle cell lymphoma. And it is especially powerful when used at the first relapse. So, and also the ibrutinib plus bendamustine rituximab together has been shown in the phase 1b clinical trial to be not only safe but effective at the front line for elderly patients with the mantle cell lymphoma. So with all this information, and we designed the phase 3 SHINE clinical trial 10 years ago. So in this clinical trial, we enrolled patients with a newly diagnosed mantle cell lymphoma at the age of 65 or older. As you can see, in the blue, as shown in blue, the experimental arm or the ibrutinib arm consists of bendamustine rituximab for 6 cycles, followed by maintenance plus ibrutinib until progression or intolerance. In contrast, as shown in green, in the placebo arm, we also included bendamustine rituximab for 6 cycles with maintenance, but here we used the placebo until progression or intolerance. The primary endpoint was progression-free survival in the ITT population. As you can see from this curve, the primary endpoint of failure, the primary endpoint of progression-free survival was met. So in other words, our SHINE clinical trial is a positive clinical trial because it successfully met the primary endpoint. As you can see, the median progression-free survival was 80.6 months in the ibrutinib arm versus 52.9 months in the placebo arm. The hazard ratio was 0.75, and these data are very statistically significant. As you can see, the two curves separated early, indicating the benefit was achieved early within the first year, and also those benefits remained durable throughout the 7-year follow-up time. So if you put the PFS, instead of months, you put them in years, in the ibrutinib arm is 6.7 years versus 4.4 years in the placebo arm. So there's a significant achievement of a net 2.3-year progression-free survival in favor of the experimental ibrutinib arm. Indeed, this is very meaningful. Imagine a patient is diagnosed with a malignant, life-threatening lymphoma with mantle cell lymphoma, and we use this regimen, we achieved 60.7 years without any disease. And this is truly meaningful and achievement in the field of for those patients. So the safety profile was no surprise. They were within our expectation and consistent with what we're seeing in daily practice about ibrutinib or BR. But please note, the most common side effects are neutropenia, and they are about 50% in each arm. The other side effects are, again, within expectations, and with the rash and pneumonia, they are higher in the ibrutinib arm versus the placebo arm. So in conclusion, SHINE is the first phase 3 clinical trial that shown ibrutinib in combination with chemoimmunotherapy is highly effective in patients, in elderly patients with a newly diagnosed mantle cell lymphoma. The median progression-free survival of 6.7 years is the highest PFS rate ever reported in this population. And it is very statistically, significantly, and clinically meaningful, and this advantage of 2.3 years. So, so the safety profile, again, is within expectation, consistent with our past data on ibrutinib and bendamustine rituximab. We believe this phase 3 clinical trial set a new benchmark for patients with newly diagnosed mantle cell lymphoma and the elderly, and for those patients who are not eligible for autologous stem cell transplantation. Thank you for coming. I'm open for questions.
Why don't you have a seat? And So I think Dr. Wong has very nicely laid out the case for an indolent subtype of lymphoma because patients can live with their disease for many, many years, but the likelihood of cure, that ultimately it will never come back or progress, is rare. So it really struck me when you told us that you started the design for the study 10 years ago. And the reason for that is because of these many years before progression happened in both to the indolent nature. It's critically important that we study the rare subtypes of common diseases like lymphoma and mantle cell. The other abstract that was supposed to be discussed in this session was a subtype of pancreatic cancer, a KRAS wild-type pancreatic cancer, and the point really was we can no longer think about big, broad designations of cancer types, lymphoma, pancreatic, breast cancer, and think that one size fits all. We are more and more and more and more subsetting to get the best possible outcomes. So this study, which was restricted to patients 65 years of age or older, showed that ibrutinib, which was already approved later line as a single agent, could safely be combined with the standard first-line treatment in an older population, the bendamustine and the rituximab, and the difference in progression-free survival of 2.3 years, that's profound, that's clinically meaningful, right? So the arm with the rituximab added up front was 6.7 years compared to 4.4. So this really can, I agree with Dr. Wong, be considered a new standard of care as initial treatment of older patients with mantle cell lymphoma. Now, just very quickly, our second highlighted abstract, and I've already said that Dr. Chi at the very last minute could not participate. It was presenting data on an epidermal growth factor receptor targeted therapy, nemotuzumab, which is approved in China, added to gemcitabine in KRAS wild-type metastatic pancreatic cancer compared to gemcitabine alone. In your press release that you got on that abstract, Dr. Kathy Eng was our content expert in gastrointestinal cancers. She provided some perspective. In your press release, you will be able to see the slides that were prepared for this press briefing. If you go to our ASCO press center and you go underneath the meeting materials part of the press briefings. Dr. Eng's summary of this abstract was that to see any survival benefit in metastatic pancreatic cancer is of great interest. This is a horrible disease. And additional studies in comparison with gemcitabine and nab-paclitaxel, which is probably our more commonly used in the US regimen, with or without an EGFR inhibitor should be done. So at this point, I'd like to open up the floor for questions. I've got those of you who are watching this online, I can see the questions pop up. Those of you who are here in person, if you have a question, please step up to a microphone. I see one microphone here anyway. Let us know your name, your organization, and who you're directing the question to. And those of you online, the chat is now open. So include, if you're online, the name of your media outlet, your own name, and who you're directing the question to.
Obviously Dr. Wang and Dr. Grello also. With results this good, would you also be studying this or going ahead and using this regimen in younger patients as well?
So in what patient?
Younger.
Younger
younger
patients,
patient.
yeah,
I
yeah,
see.
yeah.
Not really, because the younger patients that we usually treated with more intensive therapy, their overall survival is over 10 years.
Oh, okay.
And the reason to, we would hope to treat the older patients the same way, but the older patient could not tolerate those intensive therapies.
Okay, yeah, I
And
see.
therefore, there's urgent need for the elderly patients to close the gap between the young and the old, and this is really a good example of doing that.
Okay, I see, thank you.
I think it's a great question, though, because as you'll see in the next couple days, a few of the other abstracts we've highlighted have looked at a dose de-escalation kind of concept. So once we get very good survival outcomes in certain disease types, we know we're probably overtreating a good number of patients, and so can we back off in a subset on certain therapies? So the question about would this regimen compare favorably maybe to some of the more dose-intensive or the transplant protocols, it seems like a very good question to ask, because we'd love to have less toxic treatments in younger patients too.
Yes, so in this clinical trial, we found that some of the patients get a little more infections in the experimental arm. So Dr. Grillo's question is a very insightful question, because do we need to keep the drug so long? Could we rapidly dose reduce them? Could we step up our measures to fight these infections or even prevent these infections? So the escalation achieved response, then find a way to de-escalate is a strategy that we are considering in the clinical design in many clinical trials.
Great.
Thank you.
Great. Next question.
Yeah, Mary Caffrey, American Journal of Managed Care, and we cover payers. So when this gets out, if this is to be, a practice-changing result, we hear, I'm sure I'm not the only person here who hears occasionally from patients who call us directly about problems they have with insurers. And I've heard directly, actually I heard about this trial from a patient who called me because their doctor wanted to put them on this combination, and heard about your trial, but their insurance company would not give them ibrutinib and wanted to put them on chemotherapy even though they were. So what do we do about this problem when the insurance companies won't give patients with mantle cell lymphoma access to ibrutinib even though their doctors want to put them on them and it's indicated? How do we solve this problem? It could be for Dr. Wang or Dr. Graylow on behalf of ASCO.
Yeah, this is a very practical question. And in my practice, there's many times that we send a request to the insurance. The insurance people, either MDs or their associate, sometimes they don't approve the therapy. And but if you send the publication, by the way, this result was published as this morning in the New England Journal of Medicine, and is available for everybody's reference. So if you attach the New England Journal of Medicine manuscript, they usually would immediately approve it. That has been my experience. Of course, in the future, the NCCN guidelines and some other guidelines will consider whether to include this therapy in the frontline therapy. I think, I don't see why not, right? This is such great results. And so, in the future, FDA and EMA's other regulatory agencies may also consider this. And of course, the detail of those, we should direct those questions to the company like Janssen and who sponsored the study.
So I think this is a dilemma not just for this study, but for lots of studies. I have to say, before the formal data from this trial was widely available, so we had the abstract released, but we hadn't seen the formal presentation. It had not been published until this morning in the New England Journal. So now we have all of the data. It's been peer reviewed. And so it's out there. So as of today, I would say that we have the data to submit to insurance to say this is clearly the superior treatment and you should cover this. And so ibrutinib, up until now in this population, was approved as a single agent after progression from frontline therapy. But now we've got solid data published in the New England Journal, presented at this meeting, suggesting that adding it both to the standard chemo or the standard rituximab bendamustine, this is superior. So it would be much, much harder, effective immediately today, now that we have all this information out there in the public domain, to have this declined by insurance. And remember, ibrutinib is out there approved for some indication, and so it's not like it's a new drug that has yet to be approved and we have to wait for the FDA either. So I think we have solid data to support it. And to back that, a question I have for you is, in the arm that just got the bendamustine and the rituximab, how many of those patients at the time of progression went on to get ibrutinib?
So that's another very insightful question. About 40% of the patients who, on the placebo arm did not receive the ibrutinib, and then went on 40% received the ibrutinib. So this is the data. But our data continue to mature, and in the future there could be more of those patients receiving BTK inhibitors.
So, so that's insightful. So it's not really a trial of giving all three together versus giving two and then at progression giving one, but almost half did get ibrutinib, but sequenced as opposed to combined.
Right.
Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
Very accurate.
Okay, thank you.
Great. So I'll read one of the online questions next. Crystal Fend, reporting for Breaking Med. She's asking me, do I think these results might generalize to other BTK inhibitors or give hope for other trials? So I don't think that I, as a treating physician, could go to an insurance company and say, I have solid data that we can just substitute. I think we need to do the trial. I would agree there are hope for other trials, which is part of the question. Do you have a comment on that, Dr.
I totally
Wong?
agree with you, Dr. Grillo, that this information cannot be generalized to other subtypes of lymphomas. Lymphoma and the subtypes are very different. They have different prognostic factors underlined by different biology. Their clinical behavior are different. Therefore, oftentimes, study toxicity, efficacy are quite different. So it is absolutely not feasible to use this information for other histologies.
Thanks. Yes.
Caroline Helwick, ASCO Post. So a question to Dr. Graylow on the pancreatic study. I'm looking at the press release, and it's the significance is that the results of this study may change the standard of care for a subset of cancer patients with this disease. And I think that sounds very premature since it hasn't been stacked up to nab-paclitaxel plus gem, right? And in the, also that
So always tough to do cross-trial comparisons, et cetera.
I'm just asking you to say, because I'm thinking some people may pick that up and write that.
Yeah.
And I don't know if that's really true.
So Dr. Eng, who's a GI specialist, I spent 25 years as a breast specialist before taking this on. She, I think, agreed with you that this was promising and interesting. One, we don't have this EGFR-targeted agent even approved in the U.S., so it's not like this study where we can add it tomorrow. To do more studies was her point, so it's promising. We should probably look at it, but with the new standard, which would generally be nab-paclitaxel and gemcitabine. So I think you're right on in terms of how you interpreted that.
Thank you.
Great. I've got another question here from Lynn Liederman from Doximetry. She said, apologies if I missed it. Are there overall survival data?
Oh, they were asking about the overall survival data? So the overall survival data is a secondary objective. So the median overall survival for the ibrutinib arm or for the placebo arm have not been reached after 7 years. So, as we go on, the data will continue to mature for the overall survival data. But according to the data, what we collected so far, there's no difference between the two arms. The odd ratio is 1.07. And, but this is a preliminary result, and we will look forward to update you in the future.
So, and the point being, even though the study has been going on for 10 years, we don't have enough deaths, which is a good thing for these patients, in order to be able to even evaluate overall survival yet. So you didn't miss it. Overall survival is not different at this time point, but the majority of the patients are still alive in the trial.
So I must explain to the audience that overall survival is, this study is not designed to answer the questions about overall survival between the two arms. The primary endpoint is failure-free survival. If we have designed overall survival according to as a primary endpoint, the study will be very different. There will be 1,500 patients needed, and the interval will be 15 to 20 years. So that's why we use progression-free survival approved by FDA to this, because simply use overall survival is not feasible. And also, so if the overall survival is not only related to deaths related to the study, it can relate to other disease. For example, when we enrolled the patient 7 years ago, the patient meeting age was 71. So they are now 78 years, and half of them are over 80 years. So they are going to die from other causes not related to the study, and these death causes are really random, and we cannot control. So deaths from the other causes, and also deaths, the duration of survival affected by the later therapies, subsequent therapies. For example, ibrutinib is a very effective therapy used the second line, and it can contribute to the equalization of the overall survival. So it's a very complicated academic question, and it's not the endpoint we're looking for.
That's a great point. When you're doing a study targeted to an older population in a disease where survival tends to be quite long, you're going to have more deaths from other causes than from the disease you're studying. So we've got a question. Carmen Phillips with NCI's Cancer Currents blog is asking if we can just clarify the use of ibrutinib in the placebo arm. So I think my question was how many patients in the placebo arm ultimately got ibrutinib. I thought I heard about 40%. Is that correct?
Yes. So we have two arms, the ibrutinib experiment arm and the placebo arm. So many patients from this arm, because they did not receive ibrutinib, has progressed. So when we unblind them, we find out that they were not on the ibrutinib arm. So 40 of those patients received a BTK inhibitor, mostly ibrutinib, but some other agents as well.
Great. Yes, another question.
Hi, I3 Health, Elizabeth Heller. I had a question for Dr. Wang. Dr. Wang, those seem like great results, and you mentioned that the most common side effect is neutropenia. And I imagine that the patients that develop neutropenia are also susceptible to infections. I was wondering if you had any strategies to use to help prevent neutropenia, and or if these result in dose reductions, and if so, can the patients then continue with the combination?
This is really a very, very good question. First of all, we have standard practice to prevent neutropenia by giving growth factors. And that's very, very important. But also, if the neutropenia sometimes not avoidable, because you can see that neutropenia was balanced between the two arms. Each arm has 51%. So if we are not able to stop neutropenia because we have to give 6 cycles of bendamustine, that will render everybody neutropenic. So how do we prevent the infections? Then when the study was designed 10 years ago, we barely started to use the medicine in the clinic. So now we have, 10 years later, we know exactly what to do. For example, for those patients who have sinus problems, we are very aggressive. We replace their IV immunoglobulin using IV, the correct problem to the sinus. Everybody may start with a totally perfect normal sinus. After, when we're aging, the sinus spectrum could be deviated, blocking some of the foramens and causing infections. Those can be easily corrected by ENT. I will find many of those. And then, we wipe out the sinusitis so that it does not transform into pneumonia. So many of these lesions, for example, if the patient has cardiac issues, we have to make sure that they are managed optimally, and so preventive and early treatment vigilance should be used. I'm sure, after 10 years, everybody has become very comfortable in managing the side effects.
So if in the real world, when this triplet is starting to be used now, based on the results of this trial, you expect that in those past 10 years we've learned so much about how to prevent infections that the infections and serious side effects will be much less.
Yes.
That's what I heard. Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Well, we have to get Dr. Wang to his session where he's formally presenting in even more detail. So I'm going to close up this press briefing. We hope the information presented here has been useful to you. If you have additional questions, ASCO's press room staff is happy to arrange an interview for you. If you want interviews with any speakers, disease-specific experts, etc., you can just let the team in the press room know, or for those of you online, email mediateam@asco.org. I'll give a little teaser for tomorrow morning's press briefing. I think that we're just sending out the press release for that. We've added very brief comments from a couple of special guests to the beginning of that press briefing. Dr. Andre Ilbawe, who is the cancer control lead at the World Health Organization, and he will be the speaker in our opening presidential session. He's a surgical oncologist that trained both at MD Anderson as well as at my prior institution, the University of Washington, and he's now at the World Health Organization. Additionally, we'll have Dr. Kerry Adams. He is the CEO of the Union for International Cancer Control, and they have just launched the ATOM, A-T-O-M, Access to Oncology Medicines Coalition, which ASCO is a full partner in. My next meeting will actually be a stakeholders meeting about access to essential cancer medicines in low and middle income countries, and Dr. Adams will be available for a few questions about that access to oncology drugs globally, particularly in low and middle resource settings, at the beginning of tomorrow's press conference as well. So this concludes today's press briefing. I want to thank Dr. Wang, and thank you who are in attendance, and thanks for the great questions.